I stood in the back of that church, watching my son adjust his tie for the third time, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 30 years. Not joy, not pride, terror, because the woman walking toward him in that white dress, the woman he was about to marry, had a birthmark on her left shoulder that I recognized. A small crescent moon with a darker center, slightly raised, unmistakable. I had kissed that mark 1,000 times when she was 3 months old, before they took her from me, before the system swallowed her whole and told me she was gone forever. And now here she was, about to marry my son, and I had less than 5 minutes to decide whether to destroy everything or let them walk into something unforgivable. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Catherine Morrison, and this is the story of how one moment at a wedding altar unraveled 30 years of buried grief and revealed a truth that would change 3 lives forever. What I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I describe it. Every word is true, and by the end, you'll understand why some secrets, no matter how painful, must come to light. It was a Saturday in October, one of those perfect autumn days where the light filters through the trees like honey and everything feels possible. My son Michael had been planning this wedding for 8 months. He was 32, a civil engineer, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once in every aspect of his life. Careful, thoughtful. When he told me he'd met someone special, I was cautiously optimistic. Michael had been hurt before, a relationship that ended badly when he was 26, and he'd been guarded ever since. Then he brought Emma home for dinner. She was 28, an elementary school teacher with soft brown eyes and a quiet confidence that immediately put me at ease. She was polite without being stiff, warm without being overeager. When she laughed at one of Michael's terrible jokes, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Hope. Real, unguarded hope. Over the next few months, I watched them build something solid. She'd come over on Sundays and help me in the garden. We talk about books, about her students, about life. She told me she'd grown up in foster care, that she'd never known her biological parents. There was a sadness in her eyes when she said it, a kind of loneliness I understood too well. I never told her about my daughter. How could I? It was ancient history, a wound I'd learned to live with the way you learn to live with a missing limb. You adapt, you move forward, you build a life around the empty space. But sometimes, late at night, I'd still wonder, where was she? Was she safe? Did she ever think about me? The system had told me she'd been adopted, that the records were sealed, that it was better for everyone if I just let go. So I did, or at least I tried. The morning of the wedding, I woke up with a strange feeling in my chest, like something was pressing down on my ribs. I told myself it was just nerves, just the normal anxiety of watching your only child get married. I'd lost my husband David 7 years earlier to a heart attack, and Michael was all I had left. Well, all I had that I could hold on to. I got dressed slowly, a navy blue dress with a matching jacket, pearls that David had given me on our 20th anniversary. In the mirror, I looked older than I felt, 58, with silver threading through my dark hair and lines around my eyes that told the story of every sleepless night, every loss, every small joy I'd managed to hold on to. The church was beautiful. St. Mary's, a small Catholic church on the edge of town with stained glass windows that cast pools of colored light across the wooden pews. Emma had chosen it because she said it felt peaceful, like a place where good things could happen. I sat in the front row with my sister Linda, who'd driven up from Florida for the occasion. Linda knew about my daughter, about what had happened all those years ago. She'd been there through the worst of it, had held me while I sobbed, had helped me pick up the pieces when I thought I couldn't go on. The music started, that traditional wedding march that makes everyone stand up and turn toward the back of the church. And there she was, Emma, in a simple white dress with lace sleeves and a long veil that covered her face. She looked radiant, moving down the aisle with slow, measured steps. No father to give her away, she told us, just her walking toward her future on her own terms. Michael stood at the altar, and I could see his hands shaking slightly. He was nervous, excited, overwhelmed. Everything a groom should be. Emma reached the front, and the priest began speaking. Standard wedding ceremony, the kind I'd heard a dozen times before. I was only half listening, my mind drifting to David, wishing he could be here to see this, when Emma reached up to adjust her dress strap. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable. The dress had slipped slightly off her shoulder, and she pulled it back up with her right hand. But in that moment, before she covered it again, I saw it. The birthmark, small, crescent-shaped, with a darker center. On her left shoulder, exactly where I remembered it. The world stopped. I mean that literally. The priest's voice became a distant hum. The church seemed to tilt, and all I could see was that mark. That impossible, unmistakable mark. I'd been there when the pediatrician first noticed it, when my daughter was 2 weeks old. He'd said it was a congenital melanocytic nevus, relatively rare, and that it would likely stay with her for life. I used to trace it with my finger when I fed her, used to kiss it and tell her it was her special mark, proof that she was mine. But that was 30 years ago. My daughter would be 30 now, not 28. The math didn't work. Unless they'd lied about her age in the adoption records. Unless the paperwork had been wrong, or deliberately falsified, which happened more often than people wanted to admit back then. My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Linda grabbed my arm, whispered something I couldn't make out. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand, my body just moved on its own. The church went quiet. Every head turned toward me. Michael's face went from confusion to concern to something like fear. Emma lifted her veil slightly, looking at me with those soft brown eyes, and I saw it then. The resemblance I'd been too close to notice before. She had my nose, my mother's chin. The same slight asymmetry in her smile that I saw every morning in the mirror. How had I missed it? How had I sat across from her at Sunday dinners, listened to her talk about her childhood in foster care, and not seen what was right in front of me? I tried to speak, but my throat had closed up. Linda stood next to me, her hand still on my arm, squeezing now, trying to anchor me to reality. The priest cleared his throat, clearly unsure what to do. Michael took a step toward me, his face pale. In a wedding, when someone stands up during the ceremony, everyone knows what it means. Objection. Protest. Stop this before it's too late. My voice came out as a whisper at first, then stronger. I said I needed to speak with Emma. Alone. Right now. The church erupted in whispers, confused murmurs spreading through the pews like wildfire. Michael said something about this not being the time, about talking later, but I couldn't wait. If I waited, if I let this ceremony continue, they would be married, legally bound. And if I was right about what I suspected, that would be something neither of them could come back from. If your heart is pounding right now, comment, I'm still watching, because what comes next changes everything. Emma stood frozen at the altar, her face unreadable behind the veil. Then, to everyone's surprise, she nodded. She handed her bouquet to the maid of honor and walked toward me, her white dress rustling against the floor. We went into a small room off to the side, used for confession usually, barely big enough for 2 people. I closed the door behind us, and the sounds of the church faded to a dull roar. She lifted her veil completely, and we stood there, face to face. Up close, the resemblance was even stronger. I felt my knees buckle, and I grabbed the edge of a small table to steady myself. She asked me what was wrong, her voice gentle, concerned, like she was talking to one of her first graders who'd fallen on the playground. I tried to figure out how to say it, how to put into words something so impossible, so devastating. I asked her about the birthmark. She touched her shoulder reflexive, like she'd forgotten it was there. She said she'd had it all her life, that the foster families used to comment on it. Some thought it was beautiful, others thought it was strange. I asked her if she knew anything about her biological parents, about where she came from. She shook her head slowly, said the records were sealed, that she tried to find information when she turned 18 but hit dead ends everywhere. Then I told her. I told her about my daughter, born 30 years ago in a county hospital on the south side of town. About how I'd been 28, struggling with an abusive husband who drank too much and hit too hard. About how I'd finally gotten the courage to leave him when my daughter was 3 months old, but I'd had nowhere to go, no money, no support system. I'd ended up in a shelter, and they'd said it was temporary, just until I got on my feet. But the system doesn't work the way it's supposed to. They said I was unfit, that I couldn't provide a stable home. They took her during what they called a routine wellness check, and I never saw her again. I told her about the birthmark, about how the pediatrician had said it was rare, about how I'd kissed it every night before she went to sleep. Emma's face had gone completely white. She sat down heavily on the small bench, her dress pooling around her like a cloud. She asked me what I was saying, what I was suggesting. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and showed her the only picture I had left, a faded Polaroid I'd managed to keep. Me, 20 years old, holding a tiny baby with a crescent birthmark on her left shoulder. The silence in that small room was deafening. Emma stared at the photo for a long time, then looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. She asked me if I was sure, if I was absolutely certain. I told her I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. But we needed to be sure beyond any doubt. We needed proof, DNA tests, records, something official. Because if I was right, she wasn't just about to marry my son. She was about to marry her brother. The impact of those words hung in the air like smoke. Emma made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob, covering her mouth with both hands. She started shaking, her whole body trembling like she was freezing. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her, but I didn't know if I had that right anymore. 30 years of absence doesn't just disappear because of a birthmark and a photograph. Outside the door, we could hear raised voices, Michael demanding to know what was going on, Linda trying to calm everyone down, the priest suggesting they give us a few more minutes. Emma finally spoke, her voice barely audible. She said she'd always felt like something was missing, like there was a piece of her story she couldn't access. When she'd met Michael, when she'd fallen in love with him, part of what had drawn her to him was this sense of family, of belonging to something solid. She told me once that I reminded her of someone, but she couldn't place who. Now it made horrible, perfect sense. She'd been drawn to her own family, to the blood connection she didn't even know existed. I asked her what she wanted to do. This was her decision as much as mine. We could walk back out there, tell everyone it was just cold feet, just wedding day nerves, and proceed with the ceremony. We could pretend this conversation never happened, bury it the way I'd buried so much else. Or we could stop it now, tell the truth and deal with whatever came after. Emma wiped her eyes, smearing mascara across her cheeks. She said we had to tell them, even if it destroyed everything. Even if it turned out we were wrong and this was all some terrible coincidence. We couldn't let Michael marry her without knowing. We opened the door together. The church had descended into chaos. Guests were arguing in hushed tones. Michael was pacing near the altar. The priest looked ready to cancel the whole thing. When Emma and I emerged, everyone went silent again. Michael rushed toward us, asked Emma if she was okay, shot me a look that was equal parts anger and confusion. Emma held up her hand, stopped him before he could say anything more. In a steady voice, much calmer than I expected, she told him we needed to postpone the wedding. That something had come up, something serious, and she needed time to sort it out. Michael's face went through about 5 different emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, hurt, anger, fear. He asked what could possibly be serious enough to stop their wedding. Emma looked at me, and I knew she was waiting for my permission to say it. I nodded. She told him everything. About the birthmark. About my lost daughter. About the possibility that she and Michael were siblings. The church, which had been buzzing with whispers, went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that stone floor. Michael's reaction was not what I expected. He didn't get angry or defensive. He just stood there, frozen, his face straining of all color. Then he turned to me and asked if I was serious, if I really believed this was possible. I told him yes, that I was more serious than I'd ever been about anything. He looked at Emma, and something passed between them, some unspoken communication that only people who truly know each other can share. Then he said we needed to leave, all of us. Right now. We'd go to a hospital, get DNA tests, and find out the truth before anyone else got hurt. The wedding guests were sent home with apologies and promises of explanations later. The reception hall was called and told to cancel everything. Linda drove us to the nearest hospital with a genetics lab, a 40-minute drive that felt like an eternity. Emma and I sat in the back seat, not touching, not speaking. Michael rode in the front, staring out the window. What do you say in a moment like that? What words exist for something so surreal, so devastating? At the hospital, we explained the situation to a very confused intake nurse. She called in a supervisor, who called in a doctor, who listened to our story with increasing concern. They agreed to expedite the DNA testing, said we'd have preliminary results in 72 hours, full results in a week. They took samples from all three of us, swabbing the inside of our cheeks with small brushes, putting them in sealed tubes with labels and numbers. Clinical. Detached. Like we were specimens being studied rather than a family being torn apart. Those 3 days were the longest of my life. Michael stayed at my house, couldn't bear to be in the apartment he and Emma had been sharing. Emma went to stay with her maid of honor, a friend from college who'd seen the whole thing unfold. Linda stayed with me, kept me fed and functional, because left to my own devices I would have just sat in the dark and waited. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We were in limbo, suspended between one reality and another, not knowing which one we'd land in. I kept replaying everything in my mind, every interaction with Emma, every Sunday dinner, every time she'd called me, almost Mom, with a shy smile. Had I sensed something? Had some part of me known? Or was this just coincidence piled on coincidence until it looked like fate? I thought about my daughter, the baby I'd lost 30 years ago, what her life had been like, foster homes and group homes and never quite belonging anywhere. If Emma was her, if the DNA came back positive, then I'd been sitting across from my lost child for months and hadn't recognized her. That guilt was almost worse than the fear. Michael was angry, but not at me. He was angry at the system, at the universe, at whatever forces had conspired to put him in this position. He'd been ready to spend his life with Emma. They talked about kids, about growing old together, about building something that would last. And now all of that was hanging in the balance, dependent on the results of a lab test. He asked me once why I hadn't said something sooner, why I'd waited until the wedding day. I told him the truth, that I hadn't seen it until that moment, that the birthmark had been hidden under her dress every other time, that I'd been too close to the situation to see the other signs. He didn't say anything after that, just nodded and went back to staring at the wall. On the third day, the hospital called. The preliminary results were in. We needed to come down to discuss them with a genetic counselor. The drive back to the hospital felt different than the first time. Then, we'd been racing toward answers. Now we were walking toward a truth we weren't sure we wanted to face. The counselor was a woman in her 40s named Dr. Sarah Phillips. She had kind eyes and a gentle voice, the kind of person you'd want delivering difficult news. She sat us down in a small, private room and pulled out a file. She said the preliminary DNA results showed a 99.9% probability that Emma and I were biologically related as mother and daughter. The blood drained from my face. Even though I'd been almost certain, even though every instinct had been screaming it, hearing it confirmed was like being hit by a truck. Emma, who'd been sitting next to Michael, made a small sound and buried her face in her hands. Dr. Phillips continued. The tests also confirmed that Emma and Michael were half-siblings, sharing one biological parent. Me. She explained what this meant, medically and legally, in careful, measured terms. They were not, and could never be married. Any children they might have had together would have faced significant genetic risks. The relationship, as it had been, could not continue. Emma started crying in earnest then, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Michael put his arm around her automatically, then seemed to realize the gesture was now inappropriate, and pulled back. The look of confusion and pain on his face broke my heart. I asked Dr. Phillips what happened next. She said we need to work with social services to formally establish the relationship, to unseal Emma's adoption records, to fill in the missing pieces of her history. She gave us contact information for therapists who specialized in family reunification and trauma. She was professional and compassionate, but none of it really registered. All I could think was that I'd found my daughter and lost my son's happiness in the same moment. We left the hospital in silence. Emma went back to her friend's place. Michael came home with me. Linda made dinner that no one ate. Later that night, after Linda had gone to bed, Michael came into the kitchen where I was sitting in the dark. He sat down across from me and asked me to tell him about his sister, about the baby I'd lost, about what had happened all those years ago. So I did. I told him everything. About his father, about the abuse, about the shelter, about the day they took her away, about how I tried to get her back, hired lawyers I couldn't afford, filed appeals that went nowhere, about how the system had decided I was unfit and that was that, about how I'd had him 2 years later, after I'd gotten back on my feet, remarried to David, his father, and how I'd been terrified every day that they'd take him too. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said he wasn't angry at me. He was angry at what had happened, at the circumstances, at the unfairness of it all. But not at me. He said I'd done what I had to do to survive, and he didn't blame me for that. Then he asked the question I'd been dreading. What about Emma? What happened to them now? I told him the truth. I didn't know. They couldn't be together romantically, that was clear. But they'd built something real, something that mattered. Finding a way forward from here would take time and probably a lot of therapy. Over the next few weeks, the story came together piece by piece. Emma's adoption records were unsealed with the help of a family lawyer Linda recommended. The records confirmed everything. She'd been born at County General Hospital 30 years ago, not 28 like she'd been told. The foster agency had falsified her birth date to make her more adoptable as an infant. She'd been placed with 3 different families over the years, none of them permanent. She'd aged out of the system at 18 and had been on her own ever since, putting herself through college on scholarships and student loans, building a life from nothing. Reading those records, seeing the documentation of her childhood, was agonizing. Every placement, every move, every note about behavioral issues or difficulty bonding, it was all there in cold, clinical language. My daughter had grown up alone, had never known stability or unconditional love, while I'd been less than 50 miles away, never knowing she existed. The guilt was overwhelming. I'd gone on to have Michael, to build a good life with David, to have the family I'd always wanted, and she'd had none of that. Emma and I started meeting regularly with a family therapist named Dr. Janet Reeves. The sessions were difficult, to say the least. There was so much to unpack. 30 years of separation. A lifetime of questions. Emma wanted to know why I hadn't fought harder, why I'd given up. I had to explain that I hadn't given up, that the system had beaten me down until I had nothing left to fight with, that I'd been a different person then, young and scared and powerless. She wanted to know about her father, her biological father. I told her the truth, that he'd been abusive, that I'd left him when she was 3 months old, that I had no idea where he was now and didn't want to know. The hardest part was watching her grieve. She was grieving the relationship she'd lost with Michael, the future they'd planned together. But she was also grieving the mother she'd never had, the childhood that had been stolen from her. Dr. Reeves said this was normal, that reunification was always complicated, especially under these circumstances. She warned us that it would take time, that we couldn't expect to immediately have a typical mother-daughter relationship after 3 decades apart. Michael was dealing with his own grief. He'd lost the woman he loved, not to death or betrayal, but to a truth neither of them could control. He and Emma had decided not to see each other for a while, to give themselves space to process everything. It was the right decision, but watching my son hurt like that, knowing I was partially responsible, was excruciating. He assured me repeatedly that he didn't blame me, but I blamed myself enough for both of us. 6 months after the wedding that never was, Emma and I were starting to find our footing. We'd meet for coffee once a week, usually at a small cafe near her school. We'd talk about her students, about her life, about the little things that mothers and daughters share when they're getting to know each other. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where we'd both end up crying, where old wounds would tear open and we'd have to stop and regroup. But slowly, gradually, we were building something. Not the relationship we would have had if she'd never been taken from me, but something new, something that was ours. Michael had started dating again, though he told me it felt strange, like he was betraying Emma even though he knew logically that they couldn't be together. Emma was seeing someone too, a fellow teacher she'd met at a conference. His name was David, coincidentally, and he was patient and kind and knew the whole complicated story. I'd met him once, and he seemed like a good man, someone who could handle the weight of what Emma carried. One afternoon in early spring, almost a year after the wedding, Emma called me and asked if she could come over. She said she had something she wanted to show me. When she arrived, she was carrying a small box. We sat in my living room, the same room where she and Michael had announced their engagement what felt like a lifetime ago. She opened the box carefully, and inside was a collection of items from her childhood. School photos, report cards, a teddy bear that had been her only constant companion through multiple foster homes, a journal she'd kept as a teenager. She said she wanted me to see who she'd been, the person she'd become without me. Not to make me feel guilty, she clarified, but because she wanted me to know her complete story, not just the part that had started a year ago. We spent the afternoon going through each item. She told me about the good foster families and the bad ones, about the teachers who'd encouraged her, about the social workers who'd actually cared. She showed me essays she'd written in high school about feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, about wondering who her real parents were, and why they'd given her up. I cried reading those essays, seeing the pain and longing in every word. But there was also strength there, resilience. Emma had survived. More than that, she'd built a good life despite everything working against her. She'd become a teacher because she wanted to give kids the support and stability she'd never had. She was making a difference in the world, and she'd done it entirely on her own. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. She'd become an incredible woman without any help from me, and that was both heartbreaking and amazing. As we talked, I realized something important. Finding each other again wasn't about reclaiming the past or making up for lost time. It was about building something new from where we were now. Emma would never be the daughter I'd rocked to sleep 30 years ago, and I would never be the mother who'd raised her. But we could be something else. We could be two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and decided to move forward together. 2 years after the wedding that never happened, Emma got married. To David, the teacher she'd been dating. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family, held in a garden rather than a church. Michael was there, and while things between him and Emma would never be what they once were, they'd found a way to be family, to care about each other in a different way. I stood next to Emma as her mother, officially this time, legally recognized, and watched her marry a good man who loved her for exactly who she was. During the reception, Michael pulled me aside. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what had happened, about the wedding day and everything that had come after. He said he used to wonder if he'd made a mistake, if he should have just ignored what we'd discovered and married Emma anyway. But watching her now, seeing her happy and whole with someone who was right for her in ways he never could have been, he knew we'd done the right thing. The truth had hurt, but it had also set them all free to find the lives they were meant to live. I think about that moment a lot. About standing in that church, seeing that birthmark, making the impossible decision to speak up even though it would shatter everything. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, if I wish I'd stayed silent. The answer is always no. Because yes, stopping that wedding destroyed the life Emma and Michael had planned. But it also gave us all something we didn't even know we needed. It gave Emma her history, her identity, her mother. It gave me my daughter back. And it gave Michael the truth, however painful, which allowed him to eventually move forward. The thing about secrets is that they have weight. They press down on you, distort everything around them, create distance where there should be closeness. When you shine light on them, when you speak the truth no matter how difficult, you create space for real healing. Emma and I will never get back the 30 years we lost, but we have now. We have every day going forward, and that has to be enough. Because the alternative, letting that wedding continue, letting them live in ignorance of who they really were to each other, would have been a different kind of loss, one with no possibility of redemption. I've learned that family isn't just blood, and it isn't just the people you grow up with. It's the people you choose to keep in your life, the relationships you work to maintain even when it's hard. Emma is my daughter by birth, but she's also my daughter by choice now. Every week we choose to meet, to talk, to build this relationship brick by brick. Michael is my son, and watching him find his own path after everything that happened has been one of the proudest moments of my life. He's resilient in ways I never had to be, strong in ways that come from facing impossible situations and coming out the other side. Last month, Emma told me she and David are expecting a baby, a girl. They asked if I wanted to be involved, to be a grandmother this time around in a way I couldn't be a mother. I said yes, of course yes. This baby will grow up knowing her family, knowing where she comes from, surrounded by people who love her. She'll have what Emma never had. And maybe that's how we heal from trauma, not by erasing it or pretending it didn't happen, but by making sure the next generation doesn't have to carry the same wounds. So what would you have done in my position? If you'd seen that birthmark, recognized your lost child about to marry your son, would you have spoken up? Would you have let the wedding continue and hoped the truth never came out? How do you weigh one person's happiness against another's? How do you choose between the life your son has built and the daughter you thought you'd lost forever? These aren't easy questions, and I'm not sure there are right answers. All I know is that I followed my instincts in that church, trusted that the truth, however painful, was better than a lie. And I have to believe that was the right choice, because the alternative is unthinkable. If this story has moved you in any way, if it's made you think about your own family, about the secrets we keep and the truths we avoid, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice? Have you ever discovered something that changed everything you thought you knew about your life? Share your experiences below. And if you believe in the power of truth, in speaking up even when it's terrifying, even when it costs you everything, please subscribe to this channel. Because stories like this, stories about real people facing impossible situations and finding a way through, these are the stories that remind us we're not alone. That whatever we're going through, someone else has faced something similar and survived. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free.